Hello and welcome to a video on solving quadratic equations using something called the quadratic formula. Now this formula that I'm going to show you in a moment, it looks quite daunting to begin with and it looks quite complex and long and convoluted, but in reality it's not too bad, and the more you're exposed to it and the more practice you get applying this formula to solving quadratic equations, the easier it will become. Now just to recap, the methods we've already learnt about, we've learnt about solving quadratic equations using basic factoring. We've learned about completing the square, and this method here, this is just an extension to completing the square. Now if we write down the general form of a quadratic equation, it will be in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and you can think about a as the coefficient on the x squared term, b as the coefficient on the x term, and c is just a constant. Then the solutions to this equation, or you could think about it as the x values that satisfy this equation, will be minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that divided by 2a. And this is our quadratic formula. Now, like I said before, it does look a bit complex to begin with, but if we just get some practice applying it, then it will soon become familiar to you. So let's say we've got the equation x squared plus 3x minus 10 equals 0. Now you should be able to solve this by factoring, but let's just apply the quadratic formula to see if we get the same answer. Now the first thing to do is just to identify what our values for a, b and c are so that we can substitute them into our quadratic formula. So our value for a, well, a is just the coefficient on the x squared term, and here that's just 1, it's 1x squared. So a equals 1, b is our coefficient on the x term, which is 3, and then c is just our constant term, which is negative 10. Make sure you include the negative sign because that's where a lot of people slip up. And now we can just substitute our values for a, b and c into our quadratic formula to work out our solutions. So we're going to have x equals negative b, well b is 3, so I'm just going to replace b with 3. And then we've got plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that's 3 again, so it's 3 squared. I'm trying to colour coordinate this so you can see what values I'm inputting into my formula, minus 4 times a, in this case a is 1, times c, or c is negative 10. So this is our numerator, and I always like to put brackets around the 4ac just because it helps me separate the b squared from the 4ac terms. And then we are dividing all of that by 2a, so that's 2 times a, which is 1. Now we can simplify this slightly, we don't need a calculator for this. So x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root, 3 squared, the 3 squared is 9, subtract 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times negative 10 is negative 40, so it's 9 subtract negative 40, and then all of that divided by 2 times 1, which is just 2. Now if I scroll down slightly, now we're left with x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 subtract negative 40, that's the same as 9 plus 40. 9 plus 40 is 49, so it's the square root of 49, which is just 7. And then we're dividing that by 2. Now we've got two solutions here. We've got x equals negative 3 plus 7 divided by 2. And we've also got negative 3 subtract 7 divided by 2. So let's write down our two solutions. So we've got x equals negative 3 plus 7, that is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And if we do our other solution, we're going to have x equals negative 3 subtract 7, that's negative 10, divided by 2, that is negative 5. So we've got two solutions. Now if we go all the way back to the beginning and solve this equation by factoring, let's see if we get the same solution. So remember, two numbers that multiply together to get negative 10 and add together to get 3. Well, those two numbers will be positive 5 and negative 2. So we're going to have x plus 5, x subtract 2 equals 0. So we're going to have two solutions, either x plus 5 equals 0 or x minus 2 equals 0. When we solve these two equations, we're going to get x equals negative 5 and x equals positive 2, which is exactly the same answers as we got down here. Now you might be thinking, well, why didn't you just do this to begin with? But I just wanted to show you how the quadratic formula works, because we can actually use the quadratic formula to solve any quadratic equation. Notice how we could use our factoring to solve this quadratic equation, but this technique won't always work. So this quadratic formula allows us to solve any quadratic equation. So let's do one more. So if you want to pause the video, have a go at trying to solve this quadratic formula. First of all, identify our values for a, b and c, and then substitute them into our formula to work out our solutions. Okay, so I'm assuming you've had a go at that, so let's go through this together. Now the first thing to do is identify our values for a, b and c. So if we look at our equation here, our value for a is going to be 2, it's just the coefficient on the x squared term. Our value for b, well that's 4. And our value for c, that is -5. Now we've got our values for a, b and c. All we're going to do is substitute them into this formula. So we are going to have x equals -b, so that's -4. And then we're going to have plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that's 4 squared, subtract, and I'm going to put brackets here, 4 times a, so 4 times 2, times c, which is -5, and we're going to put all of that over 2 times a, which is 2 times 2. Now you could just put all of this into your calculator and that will give you the solution straight away, but let's just go through it step by step. So we're going to have x equals -4 plus or minus the square root, 4 squared is 16, subtract 4 times 2 is 8, 8 times -5 is -40, and all of that, 2 times 2, that is 4. So we're going to have x equals -4 plus or minus 16 subtract -40, that's 16 plus 40, which is 56. So it's the square root of 56 all over 4, and I'm not sure what the square root of 56 is, so now let's put that into the calculator. So what I'm going to put into the calculator is -4 plus root 56 divided by 4. And I'm also going to put in x equals -4 minus root 56 divided by 4, because we've got two solutions. And I'm left with x equals 0.87, and that is rounded to 2 decimal places. And this solution is going to be x equals -2.87, and that is also to 2 decimal places. And these are our two solutions here. Now with the quadratic formula, just be careful with when you're substituting in negative numbers. So when you've got your quadratic equation and you found your values for a, b and c, make sure that when you're putting them into your formula, you take care of the negative signs, because that's where a lot of people slip up. Now the hardest thing for you guys is probably just remembering this quadratic formula here. Now when you've got this formula down and you're confident with this formula, the only extra skill you're using is substitution. So it's not too bad, it's just about getting yourself exposed to this formula and getting lots of practice questions in. Now in the next video, I'm just going to go through solving a few more quadratic equations using this formula, just to give yourself a bit more practice. Now just to finish off with, you might be wondering, where does this formula come from? And like I said at the very beginning, it comes from completing the square. So in a separate video, I'm going to go through how we derive this formula from completing the square, just to give yourself a bit more of an understanding of how it comes about. I'll see you in the next video.